Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of The Moon That Fell from Heaven by N.L. Holmes, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me. Chapter 1. Ehli-nikkalu told herself that she had many reasons to be proud and happy. She was a princess, in fact, the eldest princess, the great lady of the mighty Hittite land. As of 7 years ago, she had been the king's wife of the rich little maritime state of Ygritte, her father's vassal. She was 35 years old and healthy, and yet, frankly, she was miserable. Every time she thought about her lot, she wanted to gnash her teeth. Even though she had been educated to sit on the throne beside her husband and help him formulate policies, she had been reduced to ceremonial roles. That's what a Hittite princess is trained to do, be a co-ruler. Who knew if she might not find herself Tawania, or whatever the local equivalent was in the country where she married. And maybe someday she, Ehli-nikkalu, would be elevated to that role in Ygritte. But for now, her mother-in-law held the post, and Shirley was only 3 years older than Ehli-nikkalu herself. It would be a race to see who died first. Shirley would delight in living to a doddering old age just to thwart the ambition of her son's wife. More galling still, her husband, King Nicumundo, held her in contempt despite her higher rank. He had left word, sent a slave to tell her, if you please, that he was coming to talk to her, and so she had to wait, as if every word from his mouth were a priceless gem. Her face blazed with fury and humiliation at the thought of him. He complains that I've borne him no children, but how many times has he denied to grace my bed, the hypocritical snake? She fought down her anger. It wouldn't do to let him know how much his disdain ate into her equanimity. She prided herself on her self-control. Her father was famous for never breaking his calm, and she was determined to follow his example. To do otherwise would be to surrender, to submit to her husband's superiority, and he was not superior by all the gods. The door clicked, and she looked up at the panel as it opened quickly, without a "may I" or "are you decent?" It was the king. They faced each other, and the hostility filled the air like smoke from tinder that had caught, not yet ablaze, but smoldering. She backed against the heavy table as if to find a defensible position and lifted her nose slightly. The armor of dignity. The king said nothing, just stood there with his swaggering good looks, and the corner of his mouth began to curl a caustic smile. His black eyes seemed to penetrate her. He knew exactly what she was thinking. She suspected it cost her considerable effort not to snarl, "What do you want?" And he, too, had his pose of supremacy to maintain. She found her face growing hotter and hotter. Still biting her tongue, she forced herself to bow, infusing it with as much sarcasm as a humble jester could bear. "Well, we're in a respectable mood this evening, aren't we?" he asked, approaching. But then he passed by her without a look, as if she didn't exist, and took up seat in the heavy carved chair. He leaned back and stretched out his legs. "I have something to tell you, and I didn't want anyone else to hear me." "You do me too much honor, my lord." The king smiled coldly. "Your father's emissary is making a visit in a few weeks, and I just wanted to make it clear that you need to be a loyal queen of Ygritte. No telling tales, no whining about how everybody is cruel to you. Understood?" "Perfectly," she said. "I lie." His eyes narrowed, and he said pointedly, "But no one is cruel to you, you know. It's all a story you've told yourself to feel above us. Have I ever struck you? Are you lacking for clothes or jewels or food? No." He tilted his head as if to consider her from another angle. "Have I ever called you barren in public?" She clenched her fists in the folds of her skirt to better control some menacing gesture she might regret. "It's my understanding that a woman cannot conceive without the intervention of a man, my lord, since you so rarely condescend to visit my bed, it isn't much wonder that I haven't given you an heir." He laughed. "I guess I must admit my capacity for self-sacrifice has its limits." Couching with you, my dear, has all the charm of tupping a hedgehog. You are very sharp, and I don't just mean your tongue. She expelled a carefully controlled breath through her nose. She knew she wasn't beautiful. She was tall and thin and angular, with a long, equine face, very much her father's daughter. It was a measure of her husband's shallowness that he hurled this at her so often, so that he can blame me for his lack of a first-rank son. So that, perhaps, he could express his contempt for his Surazine, the great king of Hatti, through her own pierced self-confidence. Well, that's neither here nor there. We don't have to love each other. Fortunately, I have another wife if I want children. Putaho has provided me with the heir you seem unable to manage, even if her rank is lower than yours. But then whose rank isn't lower than yours? The great lady, with her ancient birth and imperial aura. I just want you to understand that if you enter the emissary's presence, you will mind your manners, or there will be consequences. He fixed her with a frigid smile that had in it much menace. I will behave myself with appropriate dignity, she said through clenched teeth. I suppose you will inform him of all the disloyal overtures you're making towards Missouri. Suddenly, his cool facade dropped away and he sprang to his feet with a snarl. What would you know about my policies? All you do is so. He seemed to recover his aplomb and said more calmly, You have a reputation for being overzealous, my queen. Who is going to believe yet another of your wild-eyed accusations? Can you offer any evidence? I think not. She smirked at him, letting him wonder what evidence she could offer. His discomfiture pleased her. It was so rare that she could ruffle his indifferences. Nicamato strode past her to the door, and she noticed a small clay tablet had dropped from his sash into the cushioned seat of his chair. She dragged her eyes away from it, burying her face in a deep bow. I thank my lord husband for his gracious visit. He shot her a dark look and let himself out the door. She listened until his footsteps died away through the outer chamber and down the corridor. Then, as much as she wanted to scream and slam something breakable to the floor, she tiptoed to the chair, heart pounding, and lifted the tablet. It was in Akkadian. She saw the formal diplomatic language that united every kingdom. Something to or from a foreigner then, not just a billet-doux. Although she had a degree of literacy in the simplified script of Eurogrit, this was written in a system that required a lifetime to learn and was hence inaccessible to all but a small class of professional scribes. She pressed the tablet to her heart and stared into space, thinking hard. Who can I find to translate it? Who can I trust? Her secretary might or might not be sober at this hour, but at least she felt he was loyal. Padaya, she called to her handmaid, who was spinning in the antechamber. Go find Hadamatu. I need to see him immediately, even if he's drunk. The slave nodded and backed from the room, and she heard her rapid footsteps fade away. The queen turned on her heel and began to pace up and down, her nerves so taut she was almost twitching. What did this letter mean? It might be nothing, or it might be the evidence she needed to prove her husband was betraying Hatti land behind everyone's back. Finally, she sank into her chair and spread her hands on her thighs. It seemed an age later that a knock on the door proclaimed the presence of Hadamatu. As she had feared, he was unsteady on his feet, but at least he could stand. The poor fellow, she thought, nobody else would keep him in their service. But where would a man his age go then to find work? But it made her correspondence trying. My lady wishes to dictate something, the secretary asked in a thick-tongued slur. An attempt at a bow ended in a stumble, and the queen herded him to a chair in front of her big table, setting a damp blank tablet and a stylus before him. He reeked of wine and sweat. He had stopped taking care of himself again, she observed with a pity. Read this letter to me, Hadamatu, and keep your voice down. Having squinted at the tablet and then adjusted its distance from his eyes, he started to read aloud words that meant nothing to her. He looked up apologetically. It's in Akkadian. I know. Translate it. Can't you do that? Ehli-nikkalu's flesh seemed to crawl with urgency. She could have shaken the secretary in frustration. In response to your inquiry, he began, stammering through an experienced translation for all that. We will ready the ships and meet you at Gubla by the end of the month, as we decided before. See to it that the soldiers you promised are here by New Year's Day. The great king's viceroy will be presiding, and that will be an appropriate time to seize the port while everyone is in the courtyard for the ceremonies. Your master will find he has many loyal subjects already in the city, for the king of Hitti's exactions fall heavily on our people, especially the merchants who form our ruling class. Don't correspond again unless it's necessary. Nikamaru, son of Ibiranu. Hadamadu looked up at her, his red-rimmed eyes glaring. The king's seal is at the end, milady. The hair stood up on Ehli-nikkalu's neck. This was more than proof, it was damnation. My father must know of this at once, she murmured in a voice trembling with excitement. Nikamaru is getting ready to sell the city to misery. Who else would be strong enough to stand up to us like this? She advanced on her secretary and seized him by the shoulders. You must write a letter to my father and take it and this vile thing to Ribilu. Ribilu was an emissary, the only man in the chancery that she was sure she could trust. He was incorruptible. He alone among the lords of Ugrit who groveled before the king and his mother. Yes, milady, Hadamadu said uncertainly, fumbling in his sash for writing tools. She pushed them toward him over the tabletop. Wine fumes enveloped her. She held her breath until she had withdrawn from his proximity, and it was all that she could do not to make a sour expression. Take dictation, Hadamadu. My son and father, I greet you and pray that all is well with you in our land. Alas, all is not well in Ugrit. The king has made concrete overtures to misery to overthrow your rule. She paused. How to make this pressing? With violence. I attach for you the very letter which Nikamaru intended to send to his collaborators across the border. May it please you to act swiftly and forcefully, my dear father, your loving daughter, and so forth. Do you have all that? Hadamadu, who seemed to be rubbing out and rewriting quite a lot, his mouth hanging open, finally looked up from the tablet and replied, Yes, my lady. She thrust at him the tablet the king had left behind, and when he seemed at a loss for what to do with it, she stuffed the 2 patties of clay into his sash. Be careful with this. It's still damp, and you don't want to rub anything off. Take them to Ribilu. You know where he lives. He nodded, struggling for the words to answer. Then go. Waste no time. We must have this on the road to Hittite before the king realizes he's lost it. She watched him get unsteadily to his feet, and fear and irritation got the better of her control. By all the gods, Hadamatu, what use are you, you hopeless drunk? After all I've done for you, she cried in exasperation. Then she made her tone milder. Can you walk? Can you perhaps run? This is urgent, urgent. He bowed, one hand steadying himself against the table, and departed with a suspiciously careful tread. As he passed into the darkness of the vestibule, she clutched her head, half mad with frustration. The handmaids whom she had banished to the outer chamber with their spinning looked up, curious, but she hastily closed the door in their faces. They were all meddlers and no doubt spies for Shirley. Crackling with nerves, the queen parted the shutters and stared out the window into the night garden, where a full moon was rising over the wing of the palace opposite, bathing it in a bleached brightness. Good. Hadamadu needed all the light he could get. The wretched creature, she thought, fighting off hopelessness. Pleased to the gods, he can make it to Ribilu's house without falling down drunk in the street somewhere. How infuriating to have to lean on such a frail reed for a matter of such importance. But that was her life. Nikamaru could say it all was in her mind, but she had been surrounded by disloyal bearers of tales until there was no one left for her to confide in but these incompetents. She was isolated, alone, and that, she pronounced bitterly, is cruelty.